The air inside the Heights was thick with the scent of expensive cigars and the sharp, clinical aroma of top-shelf gin. Located 60 floors above the grinding gears of Manhattan, the lounge was a sanctuary for men who viewed the world as a series of balance sheets. Julian Thorne, the CFO of Thorne Financial, sat in a velvet armchair that felt more like a throne. At 32, his face was a masterpiece of aristocratic bone structure and emotional vacancy. He watched the rain lash against the reinforced glass, turning the city lights into smeared neon ghosts. To his left, Marcus Sterling was scrolling through a list of exotic cars on his phone, his face illuminated by the blue light of greed. To his right, Elias Vance was nursing a drink, looking bored. These were the men Julian called friends, only because they shared the same tax bracket. "You're becoming a machine, Julian," Marcus said, not looking up from his phone. "I saw your interview on Bloomberg. You talked about human capital like you were describing livestock. Do you even remember what it's like to have a pulse?" Julian didn't blink. "Pulses are erratic, Marcus. Erratic things lose money. I prefer the steady hum of a well-oiled machine. It's cleaner." Elias chuckled, a dry, raspy sound. "I bet you can't handle dirty. I bet you've forgotten how to deal with anything that can't be fixed by a wire transfer." He leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with a sudden, cruel inspiration. "The Winter Gala is in 3 weeks. It's the peak of the social calendar. Here's the wager. Pick someone from the absolute bottom. Not a diamond in the rough, a pebble from the gutter. Marry her. Bring her to the gala. If you can keep her as your wife for a month without your army of publicists turning her into a princess, I'll give you my 20% stake in the Hudson River Project." The Hudson Project. It was the white whale of Manhattan real estate. Julian had been trying to buy those shares for 3 years. He felt the familiar chill of the hunt. And the parameters? Total stranger. Someone living on the street, Marcus added, sensing the stakes rising. No professional actresses, no hidden models. And you give up that vintage Ferrari GTO if she cracks under the pressure of our world before the month is out. Julian stood up, his tall frame casting a long shadow over the table. He walked to the window and looked down at the street. The pedestrians looked like ants. Near a subway grate, where the steam rose in thick gray plumes, he saw a shape. It was a woman huddled on a crate, wrapped in a coat that was too large and too thin. Beside her sat a small child, a girl no older than 4, clutching a tattered, stuffed animal. The woman was shielding the child from the freezing sleet with her own body, a posture of primal, desperate protection. "That one," Julian said, his voice as sharp as a scalpel. "The woman with the child." Marcus joined him at the window, squinting. "The homeless mom? She's substantial, Julian. Not exactly the trophy the board expects. You're going to be the laughingstock of the city." "I don't care about their laughter," Julian replied, finishing his scotch. "I care about the Hudson Project. Stay here. I'm going to go buy a wife." The descent in the elevator was silent. Julian stepped out into the biting New York wind. The transition from the climate-controlled luxury of the lounge to the raw, freezing reality of the sidewalk was jarring. He walked toward the woman. Up close, the smell hit him. Wet wool, old cardboard, and the metallic tang of the city. The woman's name was Sarah. She didn't look up when his polished Italian leather shoes entered her field of vision. She was busy rubbing her daughter's hands, trying to generate heat. "I have an offer for you," Julian said. Sarah's head snapped up. Her eyes were large, guarded, and surprisingly sharp. Her face was weathered by the elements, her skin pale and waxy from lack of sunlight and nutrition. The heaviness Marcus had mocked was clearly the result of a body in survival mode, swollen from salt-heavy scraps and the lack of a bed. "I don't have any change, and I don't want your pity," she said, her voice a low, raspy growl. "Move along, suit." "I'm not offering change," Julian said, leaning down so he was at her eye level, though he kept a careful distance. "I'm offering a roof, a bed for your daughter, a private chef, and $1 million in a blind trust. In exchange, you sign a marriage certificate and stay in my home for 30 days. You will attend one party. You will speak when spoken to. You will play the part of my wife." Sarah stared at him. She looked at the child in her arms, Lily, who was shivering so hard her teeth were clicking. Sarah didn't ask if it was a joke. She didn't ask if he was a serial killer. She looked at the gold watch on his wrist, and then back at her daughter's blue-tinged fingernails. "If I sign," Sarah whispered, "does she get a doctor? Tonight?" "Tonight," Julian promised. "Then get us out of this rain," she said, standing up with a heavy, labored grace, "before I change my mind and decide the sidewalk is more honest than you." The penthouse at 432 Park Avenue was a monument to cold perfection. As Julian led Sarah and Lily through the foyer, the silence of the apartment felt like a physical weight. The floors were white Thassos marble, polished to such a high sheen that Sarah felt like she was walking on water. Her boots, encrusted with the salt and grime of the Port Authority bus terminal, left ugly, dark streaks behind her. "Mrs. Gable," Julian called out. An older woman in a sharp gray uniform appeared. She took one look at Sarah and the child, and her professional mask slipped for a heartbeat, replaced by a flash of genuine horror. "Mr. Thorne? These are my guests. They will be staying in the East Wing. Prepare a bath for both of them. Call Dr. Eris. Tell him it's an emergency house call for a pediatric checkup. And have the kitchen prepare something light, soup. Nothing rich." Julian turned back to Sarah. She was standing in the center of the living room, staring at a massive abstract painting that cost more than a suburban home. She looked out of place, a smudge of charcoal on a white canvas. "This is where you'll stay," Julian said. "My assistant will arrive at 8 a.m. tomorrow with the legal documents. You are not to leave the apartment without my permission. Is that understood?" Sarah didn't look at him. She was looking at Lily, who had wandered over to a floor-to-ceiling window and was pressing her tiny, dirty hands against the glass, staring at the Empire State Building. "You speak to us like we're inventory," Sarah said quietly. "In this building, everything is inventory, Sarah. Even me," Julian replied. "The clothes in the guest room are standard sizes. They'll have to do until tomorrow. Mrs. Gable will show you the way." As Sarah followed the housekeeper, Julian sat on his leather sofa. He felt a strange vibration in his chest. Not guilt, he told himself, but the thrill of a high-stakes play. He pulled out his phone and sent a one-word text to Marcus. Secured. In the East Wing, Sarah sat on the edge of a bed that felt too soft to be real. The sheets were 1,000 thread-count Egyptian cotton. Lily was already in the oversized bathtub, splashing weakly as the warm water thawed her frozen limbs. Sarah looked at her own reflection in the vanity mirror. She saw the hollows under her eyes, the matted hair, and the physical toll of 3 years of nothing. She felt a surge of terror. She was in the belly of the beast. This man, Julian Thorne, had eyes like a shark, beautiful, but devoid of light. She knew he wanted something from her, something more than just a wife. But as she heard Lily let out a small, genuine giggle from the bathroom, Sarah hardened her heart. She would be whatever this monster wanted her to be, as long as her daughter never had to sleep on a plastic crate again. That night, Julian couldn't focus on his spreadsheets. The penthouse, usually a tomb of productive silence, was now haunted by the faint, muffled sounds of a child's voice. He went to the kitchen to get a glass of water, and found Sarah sitting at the island, wrapped in a thick white robe that swallowed her frame. She was eating a bowl of chicken broth with a focus that was unnerving. "The doctor said she's malnourished but stable," Sarah said, not looking up. "He gave her vitamin shots. He said she needs rest. He's the best in the city. She'll be fine," Julian said. "Why me, Julian?" she asked, finally meeting his gaze. "You could have hired a model. You could have found a struggling actress who would have played this role with more glamour. Why pick a woman who looks like she was dragged out of a storm?" "Because," Julian said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register, "I wanted to see if the world I live in is as shallow as I think it is. I wanted to see if they can look past the surface, or if they'll choke on the truth of you." "The truth of me?" Sarah laughed, a bitter, jagged sound. "You don't know the truth of me. You just know the price of my signature." The morning light in the penthouse was blinding. Sarah woke up to the sound of a doorbell. It was 8 a.m. sharp. Julian's assistant, A man named Miller, who looked like he had been born in a slim-fit suit, was already in the dining room with a mountain of paperwork. Julian was drinking black coffee, looking as if he hadn't slept, though his suit was perfectly pressed. "Sit down, Sarah. We need to formalize this." Sarah sat. Lily was still asleep, tucked into the mountain of pillows in the guest room. Sarah picked up the contract. She didn't just sign it. She began to read, page by page, clause by clause. Julian watched her, surprised. "You can skip the boilerplate. It's just standard NDA language." "I don't skip anything," Sarah said, her finger tracing a line on page 4. "This clause here, the party of the second part shall forfeit all compensation in the event of public embarrassment or moral turpitude. Define embarrassment, Mr. Thorne. If I use the wrong fork at your gala, do I lose the trust for my daughter?" Julian paused, his coffee cup halfway to his mouth. "It refers to intentional sabotage. Going to the press, for example." "Then specify that," Sarah said, sliding the pen back toward Miller. "I want it narrowed to intentional disparagement of the Thorne brand. And I want a guaranteed housing voucher added to the upfront payment, regardless of the success of the month. I won't have my daughter back on the street because you decided you didn't like my tone." Julian looked at Miller, who looked equally stunned. "She's right," Julian muttered. "Amend it." For the next 2 hours, they negotiated. Julian found himself leaning forward, engaged in a way he hadn't been in months. Sarah was sharp. She understood the mechanics of the contract, how to protect herself, how to create leverage. She wasn't a victim, she was an adversary. Once the papers were signed, the transformation team arrived. Julian had given them strict instructions. "Do not make her look like a Barbie. I want her healthy, but I want her real." A nutritionist, a dermatologist, and a stylist descended upon Sarah. They analyzed her skin, her hair, her posture. Sarah stood in the center of her room like a statue. She endured the exfoliation, the deep conditioning treatments, and the constant measuring. "You have beautiful bone structure under there," the lead stylist, a woman named Vera, whispered. "But you're carrying so much stress in your frame. Your body is holding on to everything it can because it's afraid it won't get more." "It has every reason to be afraid," Sarah replied. In the living room, Julian sat with Lily. The little girl had approached him with a book. It was a simple story about a lost cat. Julian, the man who handled billion-dollar mergers, found himself stumbling over the words. "The cat went home," Julian read, his voice stiff. "You say it like a robot," Lily giggled, pointing at his face. "Smile, Mr. Man. The cat found his mommy. That's a happy part." Julian tried to pull his lips into a smile. It felt alien. It felt heavy. He looked at Lily's face, so innocent, so untainted by the calculations of his world, and felt a strange, uncomfortable warmth in his chest. He quickly closed the book. "That's enough for today," he said, standing up. But as he walked away, he caught his reflection in the hallway mirror. He was smiling, just a little, and it terrified him. As the days bled into a week, the penthouse began to lose its museum-like quality. It started with small things: a stray crayon on the marble floor, the smell of cinnamon and apples coming from the kitchen, the sound of a television playing cartoons at 4 p.m. Julian found himself coming home earlier. He told himself it was to oversee the project, but he knew it was a lie. He wanted to see Sarah. She was changing. The heaviness was shifting as she began to eat real meals: protein, fresh vegetables, complex grains. Her skin lost its gray, waxy sheen and took on a soft ivory glow. But she didn't lose herself. She refused to wear the more revealing dresses Julian's assistant bought. She stuck to high-necked sweaters and tailored trousers, a armor of modesty. One evening, the power went out across a 4-block radius of Park Avenue, a rare transformer blowout. The penthouse was plunged into absolute darkness. Julian felt a momentary panic. He reached for his phone, but the battery was dead. He navigated by memory toward the east wing. He heard Lily whimpering. "I'm here, baby. I'm here." Sarah's voice came through the dark, calm and steady. Julian reached the doorway. "Are you all right?" "We're fine, Julian," Sarah said. We're used to the dark. The dark is safer than the light sometimes. In the dark, people don't look at you. Julian felt his way to the edge of the bed and sat down. For the first time, they were just 3 people in a room, stripped of the luxury and the contracts. "Tell me about your husband," Julian said. The question surprised even him. Sarah was silent for a long time. David was a music teacher. He was kind. He believed that everyone had a song inside them. When he died in that accident, the music just stopped. The hospital bills for his surgery were more than our life insurance. Then, I lost my job because I was taking too many days off to care for Lily. It's a landslide, Julian. Once you lose your footing in this city, there's nothing to grab onto. My father was the one who taught me that, Julian said, his voice a low whisper. He said that falling is a choice. He said that successful people stay on their feet, no matter who they have to step on. He sounds like a lonely man, Sarah said. He was the most powerful man I knew, and he died in this apartment, alone, surrounded by gold and marble. I thought that was the goal. Is it? Sarah asked. Julian didn't answer. He couldn't. He felt Sarah's hand in the dark, searching for his. Her skin was warm. Her grip was firm. For a moment, the CFO of Thorn Financial didn't feel like a machine. He felt like a man who was very, very lost. The wedding was a clinical affair. A judge came to the penthouse. There were no flowers, no music, and no I do's that sounded like a vow. It was a transaction. Julian signed. Sarah signed. They were legally husband and wife. The next morning, the photo Julian had leaked hit the tabloids. It showed him walking out of a high-end restaurant with Sarah. She was wearing a simple black coat, her face partially obscured. The headline in the Post was vicious. Thorns, Thorns. CFO Marries secretive commoner. Is Thorn Financial in trouble? Julian's phone blew up. His board of directors was panicked. His friends were delighted. Marcus sent a text. She looks like she's had a few square meals on your dime, Julian, but she still looks like she belongs in a shelter. I'm polishing the Ferrari's hood. Can't wait for the gala. Julian threw his phone across the room. He found Sarah in the library. She was sitting on the floor, surrounded by books on corporate law and ethics. We need to practice, Julian said, his voice tight. The gala is in 48 hours. You need to know the names of the board members. You need to know our origin story. We met at a gallery. We've been dating privately for months. Sarah didn't look up from her book. I'm not lying, Julian. It's not lying, it's branding. It's a lie, she said, standing up. She walked over to him, her presence filling the space between them. She was healthy now, her eyes bright with a fire that made Julian's breath hitch. You're ashamed of me. You're ashamed that you found me on a crate. But you should be ashamed of the world that put me there. Julian grabbed her arm, not roughly, but with an intensity that shocked him. I am not ashamed of you. I am trying to protect the billion-dollar project that ensures I never end up like my father, hated and deposed. You're already like him, Sarah whispered. You're so afraid of being human that you've turned your life into a balance sheet. But look at me, Julian. I'm not a liability. I'm a person. She was so close he could smell the vanilla soap on her skin. He looked at her lips, then up at her eyes. The fat Marcus had mocked was gone. Her face was soft but strong. A woman who had survived the worst the world had to throw at her. Julian's hand moved from her arm to her cheek. His thumb brushed over her skin. He felt a jolt of pure, unadulterated electricity. Don't let them get to you, Julian whispered, his voice cracking. Marcus. Elias. They're going to try to tear you apart. Don't let them. They can't do anything to me that the winter didn't already try to do. Sarah replied, her voice steady. But what about you, Julian? Who is going to protect you from them? Julian didn't have an answer. That night, he didn't sleep in his master suite. He sat in the hallway outside the guest room, listening to the rhythmic breathing of the woman and child inside. He realized then that the Hudson Project felt small. The Ferrari felt like a toy. For the first time in his life, he wanted to win not for the prize, but for the person. The Metropolitan Museum of Art was transformed into a glittering cavern of gold and glass. The Thorne Financial Charity Gala was the most exclusive ticket in town. Every major player in the city was there, draped in diamonds and arrogance. Julian stepped out of the Blacktown car. He looked immaculate in a midnight blue tuxedo. He turned to help Sarah out. The crowd gasped. Sarah was a vision in emerald velvet. The dress was modest, long sleeves, a high collar, but it was cut with such precision that she looked like royalty. She hadn't let them starve her into the waif look popular in New York. She looked substantial, powerful, and real. Julian had given her a simple gold necklace that had belonged to his grandmother. It was the only thing of beauty his father hadn't sold. "Stay close to me," Julian whispered. As they entered the great hall, the whispers began. They were like the buzzing of locusts. "Is that the one? She looks bigger than the girls he usually dates. Look at her hands. They look like they've actually worked for a living." Sarah felt the stares. She felt the judgment of 1,000 eyes that saw her as an intruder. Her hand began to tremble on Julian's arm. "Deep breaths," Julian murmured, leaning in so his lips almost touched her ear. "You are the most honest person in this room. They are the ones who are out of place, not you." Marcus and Elias approached them immediately, like sharks smelling blood. "Julian, and the new Mrs. Thorne," Marcus said, his eyes raking over Sarah with undisguised contempt. "I must say, the transformation is adequate, though you can't really hide the pedigree, can you?" Sarah looked Marcus directly in the eyes. She didn't flinch. "You're right, Mr. Sterling. You can't hide pedigree. It shows in the way you treat people who have nothing to offer you. It shows in the way you value a car over a human life. It's a very specific kind of breeding." Elias choked on his drink. Julian felt a surge of pure, unadulterated pride. The night was a minefield. Sarah was pulled into conversations about the Hampton season and ESG investing. She didn't pretend to know what they were talking about. Instead, she asked them about their lives. She asked a CEO why he hadn't raised the minimum wage for his janitorial staff. She asked a socialite why she spent $50,000 on a dress but wouldn't donate a penny to the shelter 3 blocks from her apartment. She wasn't common. She was a mirror, and they hated what they saw. But then, the discovery happened. Catherine, Julian's ex-fiancée, stepped onto the small stage where the auction was about to begin. She was holding a manila folder and a microphone. "Before we begin the auction," Catherine said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness, "I think we should all know a bit more about our hostess. Julian, darling, you've always had such eclectic taste." She opened the folder. It turns out our woman of mystery wasn't just a victim of circumstance. Sarah was a music teacher at St. Jude's. She was fired after she filed a lawsuit against the board for embezzling teacher pensions. She lost her house because she wouldn't sign a non-disclosure agreement. She chose to be homeless rather than be silent. Isn't that quaint? The room erupted into murmurs. Julian felt the blood drain from his face. Marcus stepped forward, his face twisted in a smirk. "A whistleblower? Julian, you married a liability, but it gets better. Julian didn't marry her for her integrity. He married her for a bet. He bet me his Ferrari that he could turn a fat, homeless mom into a socialite for 30 days. Isn't that right, Julian?" The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah looked at Julian. Her eyes weren't filled with anger. They were filled with a profound, shattering disappointment. "Julian," she whispered. Julian couldn't speak. The truth was a physical weight in his throat. He looked at the men he had called friends, at the woman he had tried to save, and he realized he was the smallest person in the room. Sarah didn't cry. She didn't scream. She simply let go of Julian's arm. The emerald velvet of her dress seemed to lose its luster as she turned and walked through the crowd. The socialites parted for her like she had a plague, but Sarah didn't see them. She walked out of the museum and into the biting New York night. Julian stood frozen. Marcus clapped him on the shoulder. "Don't look so down, Julian. You won the Hudson Project shares. I mean, you lost the girl, but we both know which one has a better ROI. I'll take the keys to the Ferrari tomorrow morning." Julian looked at Marcus's hand on his shoulder. He felt a wave of revulsion so strong he felt physically ill. Get your hand off me, Julian said, his voice a low, vibrating growl. Hey, don't be a sore loser. Julian grabbed Marcus by the lapels of his $5,000 tuxedo and slammed him against a marble pillar. Keep the shares, Marcus. Take the Ferrari. Take every cent I have in my personal account, because I'd rather be in the gutter with her than in a penthouse with a parasite like you. Julian let him go and ran. He found her 4 blocks away, walking toward the subway. The emerald dress was dragging on the dirty sidewalk, the hem staining with city soot. She looked small against the backdrop of the skyscrapers. Sarah, stop, please. She turned. Her face was streaked with tears, but her eyes were cold. A bet, Julian? A fat homeless mom? Was that the description you used when you were picking me out like a piece of meat? It started that way, Julian shouted, the rain starting to fall around them. I was a machine, Sarah. I lived in a world where everything had a price. I didn't see you. I only saw the play. And now? Now I see everything! Julian stepped closer, his tuxedo soaking through. That night, the night we signed the papers, I didn't just have my lawyers check the contract. I had them check your history. I saw the names of the people who stole your pension. I saw the bank that foreclosed on your house while you were at your husband's funeral. Sarah's breath hitched. And? It was Thorn Financial, Sarah. It was a subsidiary my father started. I am the one who owns the debt that put you on the street. I didn't just pick a stranger. I picked the woman my family destroyed. And I've spent every night since then trying to figure out how to tell you that I am the monster in your story. Sarah stopped. She looked at the man standing before her, shivering, ruined, and for the first time, completely honest. You're not your father, Julian, she said softly. I was, Julian said, tears mixing with the rain on his face. But you and Lily, you reminded me that there's a world that doesn't run on interest rates. Please, come home. Not for a bet. Not for a contract. Come home because the house is a tomb without you. Sarah looked at the subway entrance, then back at Julian. She reached out and took his hand. Only if we change the locks, she said. I don't want anyone from that gala ever stepping foot in our life again. The return to the penthouse wasn't a victory lap. It was a reckoning. The next morning, Julian didn't go to the office. Instead, he called a press conference in the lobby of Thorn Financial. He stood before a sea of cameras and reporters. I have a statement, he began, his voice echoing through the glass atrium. For 10 years, I have run this company with a focus on efficiency. But I realized recently that efficiency is often just a polite word for cruelty. He looked directly into the main camera. I entered into a wager involving my wife, Sarah Thorn. It was a bet born of boredom and arrogance. I am here to publicly apologize to her. But more importantly, I am here to announce that Thorn Financial will be liquidating its predatory foreclosure division. We are launching the Lily Grace Foundation, with a starting endowment of $500 million to provide legal aid and housing for families affected by our past practices. The room erupted. Reporters were shouting questions. Julian's board of directors was watching from the mezzanine, their faces pale with fury. You're finished, Thorn, one of the board members screamed. We'll sue you for breach of fiduciary duty. Do it, Julian said, walking away. I've already resigned. He went home to find Sarah waiting for him. But the peace was short-lived. Marcus, desperate to save his own reputation, leaked Sarah's medical records to the tabloids, specifically her records of depression and malnutrition from her first year on the street. He tried to paint her as an unstable grifter who had manipulated Julian. Paparazzi swarmed the building. Lily was terrified to go to the window. They're turning our life into a circus, Sarah said, clutching a coffee mug. Julian walked up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist. Let them watch, Sarah. They're looking for a scandal, but all they're going to find is a family. We have nothing to hide. Your struggle isn't a shame. It's your strength. It's the reason I love you. You love me? Sarah asked, turning in his arms. I love the woman who looked Marcus Sterling in the eye and told him he smelled like garbage. Julian smiled. I love the woman who made me read a book about a cat. I love you, Sarah. and I'm going to spend the rest of my life proving it. The transition from a glass-walled skyscraper on Park Avenue to a weathered brick brownstone in Brooklyn was more than a change of address. For Julian Thorne, it was a spiritual migration. The months that followed his public resignation were a slow, quiet healing process. The silence in his new life was different from the sterile, lonely silence of his penthouse. This silence was filled with the scratching of a pen as he worked late into the night. Not on billion-dollar mergers, but on forensic accounting reports that traced the stolen life savings of elderly teachers. Julian sat at a mahogany desk that had seen better decades, the light from a single brass lamp illuminating the deep lines of exhaustion on his face. He had traded his tailored Italian suits for wool sweaters and corduroy trousers. He looked younger, yet more grounded. His financial genius, once a weapon used for accumulation, had been repurposed into a surgical tool for justice. He had spent months hunting down the shadow companies that had facilitated the embezzlement of the St. Jude's pension fund, the very scandal that had cost Sarah her home. It was a labyrinth of offshore accounts and shell corporations, but Julian knew those corridors better than anyone. When he finally won the settlement, it wasn't just a victory for Sarah. It was a restoration of the futures of hundreds of families. He felt a thrill in that success that no quarterly profit margin had ever provided. Meanwhile, Sarah had returned to her true calling. She didn't seek out the elite conservatories that would have welcomed Mrs. Julian Thorne. Instead, she used a portion of her trust to open the Grace Harmony Community Center in a repurposed warehouse in the Bronx. It was a place where the air was always thick with the sound of out-of-tune violins and the eager, high-pitched voices of children who had songs inside them, but no instruments to play them. One Tuesday afternoon, the first snow of the season began to dust the streets of New York. Julian arrived home earlier than usual. The brownstones smelled of rosemary, roasted chicken, and the faint, sweet scent of the vanilla soap Sarah always used. As he hung his coat on the brass rack, he heard a sound that made him stop in his tracks. Sarah was in the kitchen, her back to him. She was humming a melody he recognized, a haunting, beautiful refrain from a song her late husband, David, had written. She was swaying slightly as she stirred a pot on the stove. The sunlight hitting the kitchen window caught the gold in her hair. She looked radiant, her frame no longer heavy with the swelling of poverty, but strong and healthy. Julian watched her for a long moment, realization washing over him. He had once looked at her as a project, a bet, a problem to be solved. Now, he saw her as the anchor of his existence. "You're home early," she said, sensing his presence without turning around. Her voice was no longer raspy. It was clear and resonant. "I have something for you," Julian said, his heart hammering against his ribs in a way it never had during a boardroom confrontation. He reached into his leather satchel and pulled out a thick, cream-colored envelope. Sarah wiped her hands on her apron and turned, a playful glint in her eyes that softened when she saw the seriousness of his expression. "Julian, if this is another legal contract or a trust fund update, I'm going to make you sleep on the sofa." "It's not a contract," he said softly, handing it to her. Sarah opened the envelope. Inside was a legal deed, stamped by the state of New York. Her eyes scanned the document and her breath suddenly hitched. Her knees weakened, and she had to lean against the kitchen island for support. "The Victorian on Hudson Street," she whispered. "I bought it back," Julian said, stepping toward her but keeping a respectful distance. "The bank had sold it to a holding company. I tracked them down. I had the porch restored, the roof fixed. I even found the original Steinway piano you had to sell. I tracked the serial number to a private collector in Connecticut. It's all there, Sarah. The garden, the piano, the memories. It's yours. No strings, no bets, no conditions. You can go back to the life they stole from you." Sarah looked at the deed, her eyes filling with tears that spilled over and stained the expensive paper. She looked at the photos Julian had included. The wraparound porch where she used to sit with David. The window where Lily had taken her first steps. Then, slowly and deliberately, Sarah gripped the edges of the deed. With a sharp, decisive motion, she tore the heavy paper in half. Then again, and again. "Sarah, what are you doing?" Julian asked, shocked. "That house, it was everything to you." "That house is a ghost, Julian," she said, her voice trembling with emotion as she walked into his space and put her hands on his chest. I love that life, and I will always cherish David's memory. But I am not that woman anymore, and you aren't the man who would have bought me for a bet. We can't build a future by living in a museum of our past. She looked up at him, her gaze fierce and loving. I don't want to go back to who I was. I want to stay here, in this messy, loud, beautiful life we're building out of the ruins. I want to be with the man who fought for my dignity, not the man who tried to buy it back. She pressed the torn pieces of the deed into his hand. Give the house to one of the families in the foundation, Julian. Let a young mother who is where I was a year ago have a chance to start her own story. We already have our home. Julian held her tight, burying his face in her hair. He realized then that wealth wasn't about the assets you accumulated or the houses you restored. It was about the strength of the small things, the warmth of a kitchen, the trust of a partner, and the courage to let go of a dream to make room for a reality. 1 year later. The New York City skyline was a jagged crown of electric jewels under a crisp, violet December sky. The air was sharp enough to sting the lungs, but it felt clean. On this night, there were no gala invitations being checked at the door of the Met, no diamond necklaces being fastened by cold fingers, and no predatory bets being whispered over scotch and cigars. Julian and Sarah stood in a small, nondescript park in Queens. It was the same park, near the same subway grate, where Julian had first seen a homeless mom, huddled under a tattered coat. The transformation of the area was subtle but significant. The steam vents still hissed, but across the street, a new apartment complex stood. The first completed project of the Lily Grace Foundation. It provided permanent, dignified housing for 200 families, with an integrated daycare and job training center on the ground floor. They were joined by a small circle of true friends. Mrs. Gable was there, wrapped in a sensible wool coat, looking more like a beloved aunt than a housekeeper. She had left the Park Avenue penthouse the day Julian did, refusing to work for the new CFO. Lily was a whirlwind of energy. Now 5 years old, she was wearing a bright red coat and matching boots, running through a light dusting of snow. Her laughter was the loudest thing in the park, a silver sound that seemed to push back the gloom of the city. She wasn't afraid of the cold anymore. She knew that at the end of the night, there was a warm bed and a mother and father waiting for her. "She's grown so much," Julian said, his arm wrapped firmly around Sarah's waist. He looked at his daughter, not as a biological tie, for she wasn't, but as the heartbeat of his life. "She's happy, Julian," Sarah replied, leaning her head against his shoulder. "She doesn't remember the taste of the rain anymore. She only knows the warmth." Julian turned to her, pulling her closer. The city lights reflected in her eyes. "Do you remember what you asked me that first night? When I stood there in my $5,000 suit and offered you $1 million to be my fake wife?" Sarah smiled, a genuine glowing expression that reached her eyes. "I asked if the room was warm." Julian looked at the housing complex across the street, where families were settling in for the night. He looked at the community center in the Bronx that was thriving. He looked at the woman in his arms who had taught him that the most important currency in the world isn't the dollar, but the debt we owe to our fellow humans. "And is it?" Julian asked, his voice a low, emotional murmur. "Is it warm enough for you now?" Sarah looked at him, at the man who had traded his cold marble empire for a soul. She saw the way the people in the neighborhood waved to him, not with the subservient fear of an employee, but with the respect of a neighbor. "It's the warmest place in the world, Julian," she whispered. She leaned in and kissed him. A deep, lingering kiss that tasted of snow, coffee, and a future that no bet could ever touch. Across the bridge, in the Heights Lounge, Marcus Sterling and Elias Vance sat at their usual table. They were richer than they had been a year ago. Marcus had the Ferrari GTO parked downstairs, and Elias had doubled his stake in the Hudson Project. But as they looked out at the city, they felt a gnawing, hollow bitterness. They watched a news segment on the TV above the bar, a report on the success of the Thorne legacy and the man of the people Julian had become. "He's a fool," Marcus muttered, swirling his ice. "He threw it all away for a woman who lived in a box." "Yeah," Elias agreed, but his voice lacked conviction. He looked at his own reflection in the dark glass and saw a man who was profoundly, utterly bored. They had won the bet, but they realized, in a rare moment of clarity, that Julian Thorne had won the world. The story of the CFO and the woman from the street became a New York legend. It wasn't a fairy tale about a prince saving a damsel in distress. It was a gritty, realistic story about two people who saved each other from the cold. One from the physical cold of the concrete, and the other from the spiritual cold of a hollow, transactional life. As the snow began to fall in earnest, blanketing the city in a quiet, white grace, Julian took Sarah's hand and called out to Lily. Together, they walked away from the park and toward their home. A home where the doors were always unlocked for those in need, where the rooms were always heated by laughter, and where the music David had written finally had a place to play, forever.